Very well executed burglary, very well thought through, timed, driving off in the waiting car as the police arrived.
So how common is art theft?
Art theft is relatively common. You have to appreciate 80%, round about that mark, of art theft occurs from people's homes, from churches. The major thefts are the ones that make the headlines. They're the ones you read about, they make movies about. But by far and away, most art theft is lesser known works, usually £10,000 or under in value, that are very easily fed back into what is still a global market.
When you kind of look at it, like when people steal art, do they generally know what they're stealing, or is it just like, I'm breaking into this nice house, there's a piece of artwork, I'm going to grab it?
That's a good question. I always work on a basis of looking at a crime, how it was committed, and asking the question, are we dealing with a thief or an art thief? An art thief always knows what they're going to do with the objects they steal, and a thief is struggling to dispose of what is, generally speaking, identifiable property, which requires a specific type of marketplace to be sold back into.
How can you tell the difference, like going into a scene, so to speak? Like, how can you tell the difference between, okay, that was an art thief, this was just a thief?
Most burglars will allow themselves no more than 3 minutes in a house. And in that time, they will tear around, they'll pull open drawers, they'll have a good look, good rummage, they'll grab the electrical, the computer, the camera, they'll grab the stuff that glitters, silver, jewellery, and of course cash. They're very unlikely, unless they know what they're doing, to take the painting above the mantelpiece. If the painting above the mantelpiece has gone, then you're likely dealing with somebody that knows what they've taken.
In the things that you've investigated, was the criminal usually pretty smart in the sense like, oh, they did this, they did that, or like, no, they just broke a window and opened the door?
Well, sometimes breaking a window or opening a door is the easy way in. If you look at the break-in at Blenheim Palace a few years ago, where they stole the golden toilet named America, the criminals knew how long it would take for the police to arrive at the scene. They knew how long they'd got to force an entry to actually get up to Blenheim Palace across country, breaking their way through two sets of iron gates that were held in position with hydraulic rams. They knew exactly how long it would take them, and they didn't go in through the door. They went in through a window, which dropped them into a corridor, and right in front of the doorway into the room in which Winston Churchill had been born, through into the adjacent ante-room, which took them into the next corridor where the closet was where America was fitted. And they simply ripped it out of its fittings, rolled it back through the two rooms and out through the window and away before the police had arrived. So it wasn't a sophisticated burglary, but it was the easiest and quickest way in and out. And that's what you're looking at. Some burglars can be incredibly clever. I always think of, there were a good few years ago, about 10 years ago now, maybe even 15, there was a burglary at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And there the criminals climbed in, they broke in through the roof, through a skylight. They descended 2 flights of stairs, grabbed these 2 Van Gogh paintings out through a window and abseiled down to the floor below, driving off in the waiting car as the police arrived. Very well executed burglary, very well thought through, timed. The paintings weren't taken for their historic value. They were taken because they were the ones that would fit through the first floor window.
It is convenience at the end of it, right? Like, they plan it out, but they are going to do the simplest possible way and grab them.
Yeah, those 2 Van Goghs that they took happened to be 2 incredibly important Van Goghs, as it turned out, but they didn't really know that. The marketplace into which they were selling them was the Amsterdam drugs market. So they had a buyer lined up who, unfortunately for them, was killed before they had time to sell it to him. So they sold it to another Italian drug trafficker, and the paintings made their way to Italy, where ultimately they were recovered buried in the wall of a mafioso's kitchen.
That's what I was going to ask, is like, when you talk about stealing art, like if you're stealing these really valuable pieces, who are they selling it to?
Well, as I said, the lesser known works of art, the 80%, if you like, of what gets stolen on a daily basis, can be turned around and put back through the art market. It may take a little bit of moving around, crossing a border or two, whatever, but you can very quickly get a not particularly well-known work of art, which still may be worth a few thousand dollars, pounds, whatever you like, because it's an international commodity. The Van Goghs of this world, they line up a marketplace which is entirely criminal, and these objects are going to be used as collateral within the criminal world. They're not going to fetch anything like their market value, but even so, that's a percentage. And when you're dealing in large sums, a percentage is still a lot of money. And they can use these objects generally get used as collateral or as a currency in their own right, paying for other criminal commodities like drugs, like arms, like people trafficking. It's just a means to an end.
So when somebody's stealing something that's probably worth a lot, is that more professional? Those are kind of like, they're doing this all over the place. They're involved in other things.
Yeah, you're going to be looking at organized crime, but you're going to be looking at again, criminals who understand art and how to use it. Again, there was a phenomenally cleverly executed theft about 5 or 6 years ago at a bonded warehouse at Heathrow Airport. And the criminals broke in through the roof. They abseiled down about 30, 40 feet without setting off any motion detectors. They knew exactly what they were looking for within this warehouse, which were 3 trunks being shipped from Italy to New York. And they contained rare books belonging to 3 specific book dealers, Italian book dealers. And they were en route to a book fair in New York. And they broke into these trunks. They took a large number of books and they left by the same way they came in, without setting off any of the alarms. 3 or 4 years later, every single book was recovered, buried under a path in Romania. So you were looking at organized crime. Criminals were arrested in Romania, in Italy and London in a joint Europol exercise, police exercise. So they got the criminals. The criminals themselves recognized the rarity, the value, but then found, actually, we don't know what to do with the things. So they buried them until perhaps, Mr. Wright came along, being the buyer, and they could make some kind of sale, but they just didn't know what to do with the things. So that's the difference between your art theft and your art thief and a thief.
Do they ever get sold on the I don't know what, like, do they ever get sold to private collectors? It's like, okay, person X who's a millionaire, billionaire, like, I'm gonna buy this thing secretly.
No, I've been doing this for 9 or 50 years now, investigating art crime. And I think I've recovered more than anybody else, any other individual investigator in this field. And in all that time, I've never come across the collector who openly buys stolen goods or commissions the theft of iconic works. They just don't exist. That's a myth of Hollywood.
I guess it makes sense, right? Like, if you're going to collect it, you got to show it off, and you want to show it off to people who know what it is. And if they know what it is, then they're going to tell somebody that was stolen, and like, hey.
And don't forget, if you're commissioning thieves to commit a crime, you're dealing with criminals from the outset. And generally, with iconic works of art, the institution or the government or the insurers will offer a reward for their return. And most criminals will find a way in which they will shop, if you like, if someone's commissioned a crime, they've executed it, they will shop their commissioner and claim the reward as well. So, they're not going to stand by and say, oh, well, we're not going to tell anybody where this is. There's an extra few $100,000 of a reward on offer. We're not going to touch that. Of course, they'll go for it. They'll shop the collector if anything was actually commissioned. But it's just most people, when they suffer a theft, even museum curators, they can't believe that such a rare object has gone from the museum's collection, and they instantly assume that someone's going to actually pay what it's worth to have it. Well, they're not. They don't. These things will always go for, as I say, quite a small percentage of their actual value. And these collectors just don't exist. What you're dealing with is organised crime.
So how did you get into this?
Well, first and foremost, I joined the Metropolitan Police in London when I was 19. When I was 20, my parents' home was burgled, and the family silver was stolen. And I knew the first available marketplace because I always had an interest, a hobby in art and antiques. And I knew the first available market that this stuff could be sold at was, within 36 hours. I happened to be working nights. I went straight down to the market, recognised the family silver, and arrested the stall holders. We then arrested an incredibly professional art and antique thief. And I've been doing it ever since.
So how do you investigate an art theft? Is it different than other kinds of crimes?
Yes, it is different, actually. One of the big differences, actually, is that the owners are very interested in recovering their stolen property. Even if it's objects of little value, they've come by them because, they like to go out and buy. They've started a collection, and these pieces mean something to them personally, or they've inherited them. And then, of course, there can be an even bigger attachment to them because they've come down through the family. So people actually want it back. If it's a computer or that's been stolen, most people are pretty glad that it's annoying. They may have lost what was on the computer, but if it's all backed up somewhere on the cloud, they can get that back. And they end up with the insurers paying for the latest model. So actually, they're quite happy about that. So that's the first and foremost, that people want the stuff back. The other thing is, of course, that unlike your computer, which is devaluing by the day as it gets older and new models are brought out, antiques tend to increase in value the older they become. So from a police perspective, you have those two elements to deal with. And there is a conflict of interest between the police generally and the owners, because the owners want to get the things back first and foremost. The police want to get the criminals first and foremost. And sometimes where they get the criminals and prosecute them, but don't get the property back, they don't bother to then continue looking for the stuff. That's kind of very much left up to the owner or the insurer or the institution to continue looking and hopefully to recover the stuff.
Is it usually harder to get the criminal or harder to get the stuff back?
Oh, both can be extremely difficult. I've said, that the art market is a global market. Objects tend to move. They can move big distances. They can move across international borders. And that makes the investigation of them difficult because the formalities that law enforcement have to go to be able to conduct investigations in other countries can be, quite, they can be difficult, let's put it that way. It's not made easy for law enforcement, whereas it's very easy for the criminals to move these things across the borders.
So what would your success rate be? I find it 80%, 10% of the time, 50%.
I'm not saying my personal success rate, but the success rate in the recovery of art and antiques is abysmally low. It's round about the 3, 5, maybe as high as 7%, which means that you're talking in the 90% of stuff that does not get recovered. And that's across the board. That's in most countries.
That makes sense to me, actually, why it would be so low, because, like, how do you even find it? Because it could be anywhere. Is it usually the kind of thing when you catch somebody that, like, okay, they stole it from a museum and it turns out to be the brother of the security guard, right? Like, is it usually some kind of connection that allows you to figure this out?
Depends on the object, largely. We've recently seen this theft from the British Museum. That is not entirely unique to institutions, libraries and museums. Where they lose objects, there's quite a high percentage of those objects are taken by members of staff, and, for all sorts of different reasons. Museums, institutions tend to have a bigger security budget, and so little is stolen, if you like, by the front door. It goes out the back. When you start talking about people's homes, private collections, religious institutions, it's the reverse. Most stuff goes out through the front door.
Like, if it's going to be something with a big security, right, it's got to be somebody who kind of knows how that security works. But if it's someplace like home or a church, it could just be anybody.
Largely, but also you'll find that where they're going for the big numbers, the criminals do a lot of research. If you take the Scream, which was one of the paintings that I was involved in the recovery of, stolen from the National Gallery in Oslo in 1994, the man that organised that theft made repeated visits to the gallery to assess security and work out the easiest way in which to steal that painting. So they will go and they will check on the security. And where you have a major art theft, you will find that the criminals have been in, they will have reconnoitred, they will have seen the Achilles heel in security, and that's what they'll go for.
How do you then investigate that? You're just kind of looking through security footage and...
CCTV can help you. Maybe, for instance, an increasingly facial recognition might tell you actually who the names of the people are. You're looking at the forensic examination of the scene of the crime, hopefully to find some DNA or other, fingerprints or other identifying evidence that you'll be able to utilize. I personally, I am of an era where, today's methods of investigation, DNA was only just coming in when I retired from law enforcement. So I was much more reliant on, shall we say, a much more old-fashioned way, which was talking to people and learning from informants, criminals that I would know, that I would go and talk to and ask questions of as to what they knew about the crime and who'd committed it.
And that this word kind of spread fast? Word
can spread very quickly. You may even get advanced warning. A few years ago, there was going to be an exhibition, a diamond exhibition at the Natural History Museum in London. They were forewarned of the robbery that was going to be attempted on that exhibition, which would have put not just the museum staff but the public at risk in its execution. So they simply cancelled the exhibition and it never took place. So you can get wind of these things in advance, but otherwise you're reliant on playing catch up.
Are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions?
Yes, fire away.
What's your biggest case?
I think probably the biggest case, just in terms of the value of the objects, the length of time I was investigating it, and the difficulties connected with the investigation, was something called the Sevso silver. It was a hoard of Roman silver that was, when it came on the market in 1990, it was said to have come from the Lebanon. There was also a rival account of it having come from Yugoslavia, or to be specific, Croatia, as it later became. And another claim from Hungary, all claiming this hoard of Roman silver came from their jurisdiction, from their territory, and every single one of them saying it's part of our national patrimony, we must have it back. That was finally resolved in 2017. It was a highly complex investigation, which I continued to work on after I retired from law enforcement on behalf of the Hungarians. And you can see the Sevso silver today in the National Gallery in Budapest, as it was found to have come from Hungary.
Is that common to have a big argument among countries about, well, whose is this really?
It can be, particularly with antiquities. You know, we've largely been talking about fine art and antiques. But when you start looking at the world of antiquities, these are archaeological items generally, then they come to the market with no provenance. Nobody knows exactly where they've come from, and it is very, very common to then have rival claims and for matters to go through the courts, who are left to decide who has the better claim. And again, part of the investigation, scientific evidence to support the claims will all be important to that court hearing.
Smartest criminal, dumbest criminal?
Oh, I think that I can answer the latter first. The two dumbest must be the two guys that thought they'd break into the National Gallery in London one night, and came to London armed for the occasion with dummy grenades, imitation handguns, handcuffs to tie the guards up with, and some jemmies to force open the back doors. They arrived nice and early in London and parked their car and went off to buy some cigarettes, and when they came back it had been clamped. And they used one of their jemmies to try and force the wheel clamp off, and the police arrived and arrested them for causing damage to the wheel clamp. But when they opened the car up, they found all this stuff to go and break in, and they admitted they were going to, they were targeting the National Gallery, but they had a list of the kind of Forbes most richest people in the world that they were going to be offering the National Gallery collection to. I mean, they were seriously dumb. So I think that's the easiest one.
Man, there is no end to dumb criminals.
The brightest, crimes like the Van Gogh Museum. A chap called Durham was his name, a Dutchman. He admitted, ultimately, I mean, he was caught because when he hit the ground, having abseiled down the front of the building, the cap he was wearing shot off, and they were able to recover that and got his DNA from his hat. So he was identified and he went to prison, and it wasn't until after he came out from prison that the paintings were ultimately recovered in an Italian Guardia di Finanza investigation into this mafioso. And there they found these paintings walled up that he was going to use as a get out of jail free card, negotiate his way into freedom by handing back these paintings. So his wasn't to be used as collateral or anything like that. It was for other criminal purposes. But the guys that actually committed that, Durham, it was a well-researched and executed crime. It wasn't violent in as much as, they didn't shoot the place up. They wouldn't threaten anybody personally. It was well-researched, well-executed, and they disposed of the goods. Hats off to them. That was a well-carried-out crime.
Why are the major ones usually found? Is that just too many people looking for them? Like, why are the major ones usually found?
Yeah, the major ones are found for a number of reasons. When you have something like the Scream, Norway's most important cultural object, really, when that gets stolen, the resources the Norwegians put behind recovering it were enormous. They were fortunate in that, I was on the Art and Antique Squad at Scotland Yard at the time, and we sat down and discussed, is the Scream likely to come to London? And the answer was yes, because London is by far and away Europe's largest art market. Therefore, it attracts by far and away Europe's largest number of art criminals as well. They go hand in glove. So the chances were that it was going to come through London. So we prepared an undercover operation with the help of the Getty Museum. As I say, I was working a lot out in LA in particular, and had good relations with them, and they supported us, and we were able to then execute that undercover operation and recover the scream. So, huge resources were applied to its recovery, far more so than you would have found if it had been, my family's silver stolen from our house, when I was 20. That was only recovered because I spent so many years cleaning the damn stuff. I'd recognize it anywhere. And there it was, sitting on a stall in a market. That's the difference. It's the kind of resources that get applied because of the importance of the object. When an object gets stolen from a major institution, it's in the institution because it's an important object, and that generally fires up major investigations. They'll be covered by government indemnity in terms of insurance, and governments want their collections back.
Do you have one that got away? Like, I never figured that one out.
Yeah, the one that has defeated all of us investigators in art crime, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. 1990, St. Patrick's Eve, the eve of St. Patrick's Day. Two guys went into the museum disguised as Boston police officers, tied the guards up, and walked out with, a phenomenal art collection, which has never ever been recovered. Today there's a $10 million award on the information that will lead to the recovery of those works of art. Not a whisper,
No clues, no nothing.
No, and that's since 1994. There is the risk that they could have been destroyed, of course. But no, that is the big one. That's the Holy Grail for art investigators.
Do you think it will ever happen, or is it like so much time has passed? Like, I don't know.
No, funnily enough, I was asked to give a talk about that particular crime to a group in Boston only this past April. And I used as an example there a painting by a Cornish artist, my family are Cornish, called John Opie. And it was stolen in America 30, 40 years ago, and it was recovered last year. And so these things can go missing for a very long time and still come back. And that particular painting came back in very good condition. So, and again, there was a magnificent Picasso that I recovered together with a colleague I work with in Amsterdam, that had been stolen in 1990 in France, and we recovered it in, 2019 in Amsterdam, in near perfect condition. So these things can go missing for a very long time and still come back. So yeah, we haven't written off the Gardner Museum paintings, but we'd love to get some indication that they're still about.
Is it more common now? Is art theft more common now than it was in the past?
It's a difficult one to answer because, statistically, law enforcement have never kept specific records relating to the theft of art and antiques. So that's a difficult one to answer. What we do know from the statistics that have been made, for instance, in cultural heritage objects, I think the instances of crimes against cultural heritage have increased dramatically. And that's because people they're much more able to travel than, they were a century ago. They get around to go and see these places. The places themselves are more exposed than they were. Objects are more available. So I think, with the sort of general quickening of the pace of life generally, so the increase in crimes against art and antiques have increased at the same rate. In terms of the iconic works of art, this tends to go in kind of cycles, really. And since COVID, touch wood, the instances of art theft, of iconic work of art, have fallen since COVID.
This is a little bit of a lighter one. Movie scene that drives you nuts.
It kind of relates to the type of scene that drives me nuts, but it's almost the reverse of it. It's a kind of acknowledgement. James Bond in Not Doctor No, and he's just arriving at Blofeld's underground lair, and as he walks up the steps, he sees there's the painting of the Duke of Wellington by Goya that was stolen in 1961, and when that film was made in 1961 was still missing. And then he kind of pauses and looks as if to say, that's where that went. But there's a definite acknowledgement that, it's this megalomaniac master of organized crime who was responsible for its theft.
Is there any ever instances like where the movie stuff is kind of right? Like where they're dodging the laser grid to get to the painting and replacing it with a replica? Like, is any of that stuff even close?
Sometimes you can say things get replaced with a replica, not so much in institutions. You have curatorial staff that keep a pretty close eye on their stuff. It gets looked at in terms of conservation. So it goes to the laboratory to see whether it's deteriorating or whether it's in good condition or if anything needs to be done by way of a restorative treatment. So, things there get recognised pretty quickly. There have been the odd instance where, copies have been used to replace the original. But it's more a thing of myth than fact.
That's pretty much all the questions I got. Is there anything that you think we missed or anything like that?
Not really. No. All I would say is if anybody wants help in the return of the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum, let me know. I'm still available for that one.